Samira. Samira is one of the very first students I admitted at the Hall, and I can vividly recall interviewing her in Bruce Mitchell's room, along with Reggie, Bruce, Sarah Ogilvie-Thompson, and I believe Sarah's dog. Yeah. And what impressed us all at that interview was her seriousness and the utter focus of her mind. She came up to the Hall in 1986 and threw herself into her academic studies. She was one of those students who was good right across all aspects of the course. But she also managed to carve out a very, very good career as a student journalist, and, like Emma, won the Philip Geddes Journalism Prize. And what was one of the most moving things with Samira was to watch the steadily emerging and strengthening feminism during those years. Many people will be familiar with her profile as a reporter and presenter on Channel 4 News. I'm sure you all recognise her face from that, where she stayed from 2000 to 2011. She made the Channel 4 documentary series Islam Unveiled about feminism and Islam in 2004. In 2009, she won the Broadcast of the Year Award for investigation into so-called corrective rape in South Africa. Recently, she's moved from Channel 4 to the BBC, where she presents a range of programmes, including Sunday Morning Live on BBC One and Night Waves on Radio 3. She also presents the Proms for BBC 4 and has presented PM, The World Tonight, Profile and Sunday and on Radio 4. She has a column in The Big Issue, and her writings appeared in The Guardian, The Independent and on the Spectator magazine's website. Samira.
I'm going to have a go with this mic because actually I don't have a great projecting voice. My idea that I pitched to Lucy was the world in words, because I think the art of news writing is underestimated. And Emma gave a really great talk about sort of some of the great principles of it. I'm still super keen on news. I love it, and I couldn't live without it. And I just thought it was quite useful to look at how and why good news writing works. And to some extent how new technology has changed that, but the art of the words. And I'm going to focus on writing for broadcast because people, I think, sometimes underestimate its importance. So I've put up the BBC News website to start with, and in fact I might just move over here. Because the way that we access news now, you have more choice, but it still depends on words to kind of get you up there. So the main thing I think is of interest is down here, where you have the section called Most Popular. So it can be shared. Now, interesting enough, the first story is Bangladesh Rally seeks death penalty. This is a feature by David Aronovich about an archive out tonight about the novel of 1984. The use of the quote marks are unhistoric. That's obviously, a matter of dispute. But it's amazing how quickly you can get into that. Most read. Right, I love this one. John Kerry refuses to speak French. Don't you just want it to? Right, where's this working with this? Right. There we go again, fatal crash. A shocking crime even for Mexico. Right. If you don't know it, you would click on it. If you knew if it had the word gang rape of tourists in the villa, you might not. So it's part of the art of getting you to look at a story that you might not think to look at, and perhaps when they get sucked into more news. And horse meat disaster again. The quote mark's quite significant, and this is one of my favourites. Amish beardcat and mullet gel. The word mullet without a capital M would obviously have another whole dimension about hair. So I just love that. Right, that's the first one. So the kind of basic principles of great news writing are: it should be simple, it should be eye-catching if it's on a website, and it should tell the story. I've got a piece actually I'm going to go back. This is one of the best pieces of news writing about the new Archbishop of Canterbury, and I found it on the Newsround website, which you may know is the children's news programme that the BBC does. So click on it, and it's the guide to the new Archbishop of Canterbury, and it's very well done. So it engages children. Bishop Wilby gave up. So these are the facts. Who is he, and what will he have to do? Bishop Wilby gave up a top job with an oil company so he could train as a priest. He decided to work for the church after his 7-month-old daughter died in a car crash. Now, An awful fact told simply. I actually read a lot of the main newspaper website coverage that day. Most of them didn't have that now. You can click on more to see, and then there's they've got quotes from him about how it affected him. He only became a bishop, a senior member of the church a year ago. Tells you a bit about where he worked. What does he do? It's a massive job heading up the Church of England. And you know what? That's a bit where you notice it's a bit simple, but essentially, on top of that, he deals with the church's relations with the faith. That is it. What do people say about him? Again, some people are worried he hasn't got the experience to do with it. It's done in a simple outline form, but it's actually the best one-page digest of that story that you were going to see that day. So it just shows you that where you look for great news writing isn't perhaps also always where you think to look. So the key thing about news writing is, for broadcast, is it's 3 words per second. I tend to read and speak a bit faster than that. And it took me, and I've told Lucy this, about 15 or 20 years after leaving Oxford, to start working out that what I did every day was what I'd been doing here, which was critical appreciation. Look at what someone has written or said, work out what was the most important points, sub it down, and deliver it in a form that's accessible without burying the lead. And some of that is also had to pick out a clip, a short amount of a soundbite of someone's interview, and then work out how to use it. It's about picking out a good quote from a book or a poem. In broadcast news, crucially, we're doing it in real spoken English, so you're addressed to one viewer and not to a sort of reading audience. And it's really interesting how different it is. So I'll give you an example. This is the first sentence from Friday's lead story in The Guardian about the education reforms being changed. Michael Gove and the school's minister David Laws are to press ahead with major reforms to GCSEs as early as 2015, even though the Education Secretary has been forced to beat a retreat on renaming the exams and introducing a single examination board. Now, you would have read that and it would make perfect sense, but you would never, ever attempt to say that out loud or speak that way. And again, it may be obvious to many of you, but I don't think people always appreciate the difference, even in news writing, between print and writing with a kind of broadcast idea. And the BBC, and I will be using the BBC a lot, is because it's one of the best run websites, it sort of has found that new language balance between traditional broadsheet prose, tabloid prose, and sort of broadcast voice, which is very, very accessible. I got my first... Oh, can I ask a quick question, Lucy? How long do you want me to talk for?
Well, I think we agreed sort of 20 minutes.
Fine,
10
okay.
minutes.
But I came, so I didn't know yesterday, I wrote a version that could be 15 or 45, which is also what you do. You work out sub down, so I thought I'd get that in there as a public moment. Fine. So I got my first and arguably most important training in the BBC radio newsroom where I was a trainee. At first you were given, perhaps in a whole 12-hour shift, one 20 or 30-second story to write. So think of that, 3 words per second. So you think in seconds rather than being given 150 or 200 words. But crucially, what you packed into that story could be important. It could be a story you couldn't put higher up, there wasn't time. This is an example from this morning's 6 a.m. Radio 4 News Bulletin. I was up early. It was a penultimate item, and because the summary is only 4 minutes long. The funeral will take place in Chicago today for a 15-year-old who was shot dead a week after performing as a majorette at President Obama's inauguration, full stop. Michelle Obama will be among those attending, full stop. It's 12 seconds, that's it. That's all they had time for. But you learned something important. There was actually, I think there's something moving in there. And you might well go and look up more on the story. And I loved my months in that newsroom where you just sat and you distilled down your prose to... I only have this much time, I'm not allowed more. Mother Teresa died the same day as Princess Diana. She got much less, of a write-up in the news. So sometimes these things happen, but you can still try and make the most of it. I'll quickly take you through the rest of the formats. A longer story, you will have an intro. Always 2 sentences to allow time for the audience to catch up. So it might be something like, funeral will take place today for a 15-year-old who was shot dead a week after performing as a majorette. Michelle Obama will be among those attending as John Smith reports. Just to give you a chance to adjust to, right, this is the next story I'm into, then you have the reporter's voice. A reporter might just do a 40-second voicer, straight script. You might be given something more like a minute, which we call a wrap, where you wrap your script around a little piece of actuality, a small sound effects of the riots in Tahrir Square, or a little bit of the music of James Taylor performing at the inauguration, and something which gives you atmosphere. And it's that combination of sound, or in case of television, pictures and sound, and the words combined, which has its power. I never knew that writing for television and radio would be so satisfying. I always thought I was going to just be a newspaper writer and write long form. And it's incredible how much you can do, and often by paring it right down, distilling it down, and sometimes taking away script and letting the sound talk for you. And it's a luxury that I'd never want to give up. I'd never want to give up writing for broadcast. So look, I've got a quick clip actually I want to show you. So sometimes, and this is something Emma mentioned, you talked about news writers thinking that fact is truth. And I have a whole issue about how news editors sometimes make assumptions about what they think is news. And then you hear a bulletin and you think, well, that's all there is that we need to know about. And there's a lot of stories, of course, that are left out and dropped off. And that omission is a huge concern for me. And it's a big part of something I encourage. When I go into schools, I always tell students, listen to the news critically and think about what's not there. If you see it in another outlet, why is it not on that bulletin? In a democracy, it's quite interesting how our minds are shaped to work out what we think is important, and perhaps that's about omission. So this is an example. I used to get a lot of this at Channel 4 News. Lucy mentioned my feminism. There's this obsession in a lot of highbrow newsrooms that crime is sort of tabloid, and it's a bit distressing, and viewers don't like it. So we had this case where there were 2 horrific convictions of murderers of women, and the editor said to me, well, we can't have 2 women's murders on the news because it would be too depressing. And you just think, well, you never said that. You can't have 2 stories about politicians and the minutiae of Westminster on the news, because that would be too boring, because actually a lot of our viewers don't care. So I was told I could get this one in, but I would have to not have a proper package where I'd have 3 or 4 minutes and run a decent script. I'd have to do it all on my own, edit it myself as an oeuvre. And an oeuvre is an out-of-vision read, where you cut a sequence of pictures, possibly with little gaps in the middle where you're going to up the sound and hear someone speaking. And you're speaking live over it with an eye on the pictures as you read it, so that you don't crash into bits of sound. And so this is one I did. It's a story about a parcel delivery worker who had abducted this young girl on the way home from the disco, and just murdered her appallingly, and had hidden her body in the freezer, I think. And I found a clip of the mother saying, you always think you know when something's happened to your child, and I didn't. And it was just so amazing to me. So anyway, I did it in 1 minute 15, and we got in the police officer who was amazing about the investigation. And for me, these stories are important because they build up a picture in which we appreciate the scale of violence, and also the influences, which is to do with hardcore pornography, to do with the treatment of repeat offenders who aren't necessarily sent to jail for rape in the first instance, attitudes to women in general. So that's a story about omission in a way, and the news writing, you can only be as good as if you're given the chance to do it. The headlines I just talked about when I showed you the website. And I wanted to give an example of American writing in comparison, because I really hate the New York Times. I think it's so pretentious most of the time. And what I really hate is they have this thing, everyone wants to win a Pulitzer. And so you look at it, even the front page lead story, and it'll be something like, tears rolled down her cheek as she remembered the night that the drones landed. And somewhere down there it'll tell you that, 10 people died last night in this attack on an Afghan wedding. And I just find that really annoying, because it's actually so self-indulgent. It's not about the reader. And never mind, you have to turn the page to kind of find the rest of the story. Now, when I looked online, actually, I found quite a good example of a New York Times writing. And I wanted to give you these 2. So. Right, this is actually from Fox. I thought I had to put something from Fox News in. And it's actually quite fun. It's a terrible story. It's this ex-soldier who's gone nuts and has killed a load of people and then hidden out in the mountains. But the writing is sort of like New York Times style. The hunt for Christopher Dorner in the snow-covered San Bernardino mountains is expected to resume at daybreak, and authorities hope clear skies. Actually, that's improved since I wrote it earlier today. But a lot of it is actually, it began the sentence, all that could be seen were his snowy footsteps leading away from the abandoned vehicle. And that was actually what I wanted to show you. But I've got a New York Times one, which is interesting because actually it's quite well written, but it's got this weird tone thing. And a big part of what's important is being neutral. And like you said, Emma, letting the emotion come through a language that is unemotional, keeping the temperature of the language down, as you said, can be really important to letting the story show. But this is an appalling story, and it's a story that's connected to previous events. Gunmen killed Nigerian polio vaccine workers in echo of Pakistan attacks. Now, in a way, it's a great headline because it tells you straight away that there's a backstory, which is that a lot of Muslim Islamists, promote the idea that international vaccine programs are there to sterilise Muslims or to poison them or to do something terrible. But it has this weird sentence. So the first sentence is fine. At least 9 polio immunisation workers were shot to death in northern Nigeria on Friday by gunmen who attacked 2 clinics, officials said. But this is the one. The killings with eerie echoes of attacks that killed 9 female polio workers in Pakistan. And you just think the word eerie adds nothing. It's so unnecessary. It's just annoying. But what is also important, and I think that this story, I don't know how many words, you could probably guess it for me, Emma. It's quite a short front page story when I picked it up at 6 this morning. But it has, crucially, it has context. So they interviewed someone from UNICEF who's been working in vaccination programs for a decade to say even before 9/11 they had trouble with Muslims suspicious of these programs. But crucially, since the vaccine ruse in Pakistan, she's referring to the ruse whereby the US military went looking for Osama bin Laden under the cover of a vaccine program. Frankly, now I can't go to them and say the CIA isn't involved. So it's actually, I've chosen an example of wonderful news writing, in a way, by the New York Times, except for the word eerie, which is really stupid. Right, what's my next one? Right, I mentioned the issue about values and omissions, so stories that are not put in. And sometimes it's about the sort of placing of them. So I present this programme called Newswatch on BBC One on Saturday mornings. It's recorded on Friday, which is why I'm here and not there. And the viewers come in and they talk about stuff that really annoys them. So this week, on Monday, the big story everyone's waiting for, 10 a.m, University of Leicester announcing the finding of, or the confirmation that it's Richard III under that Leicester car park. What a story. Loads of people watching the news conference live. Huge moment for Leicester. And all credit to the archaeologists. And 17 minutes in, they break away on the BBC News channel to bring you the breaking news that Chris Huhne has pleaded guilty to that driving offence. And they didn't just scroll the text, which is a great liberation. You could have just done that. They took you away, told you, took you to the court where a reporter standing outside, not Chris Huhne coming out and crying, a reporter standing outside told you. And then they took you back to the news conference, and people were furious. And then they interrupted it again to do the same thing with the same correspondent and then a political correspondent. But it could have waited. And as a viewer said to me yesterday, this is like the raising of the Mary Rose. We're not going to remember in a few years who Chris Huhne was. But the discovery that Richard III was buried, under that car park in Leicester is history. It's really important. And to be there in that room, as you were, with the camera there, watching those academics present, 45 minutes, it was a really well-run news conference. That's what breaking news is for. And I completely agreed with them. It was brilliant. And the management are too cowardly to come on half the time, so we just let the viewers have their say. But it's great. What's great about news writing now is if people don't like what you're doing, they complain, and there are potentially outlets. But the other issue about that, to say, was, what was the priority given, and did we miss something important? And one of the great things about it, which I'm going to see, you won't be able to hear it, but I can play it for you, is the use of content which has no words on it. So I'm talking about news writing, but sometimes the power of news writing is when you have a story, right? This is a great one. This is the Chris Huhne story, but it's on the ITV website. And they use clips of actuality, where they don't put any comment on it. So first thing you need to know is, and ITV is the only ones who do this yet, they're brilliant. They aggregate a timeline to news content. So you can see the latest version of the story. This is from yesterday, so it's probably updated. But you can scroll down through the timeline as different updates emerged. So if a story's been breaking, you can sort of pick up how the story happened and where stuff went wrong. And somewhere here is footage. If I could play this, and I would. It's just 28 seconds of her walking into court. And actually what you would hear is just the cameras and the photographers going, this way, Vicky, stop, some nutcase behind with a sign. And it's quite interesting because these things enable you to see what the news media see, which is there's a performance involved. She's chosen to stop. She's chosen to let herself be taken, have her images taken. And then you realise that what you see on a bulletin with reporters talking all over it is mediated, so you're further away from it. Here it's like you were there. And even though it seems, that's a very short, boring clip, that sense of uncommentated video is really important for you to get inside the story, and then you can read the text around it. And what I love, for example, of blogging is that when I blog about films, I'll embed the trailer, so you can be watching the trailer while you're reading the text, and that's added a new power, I think, to news writing. It doesn't replace it; it kind of complements it in a slightly different way. But the only other kind of quick thing I wanted to mention was picking up the story, and this goes back to what I said with Lucy about when you read something, what are the key salient points here and how do you do précis? And I want to give the example of a trial. Operation Crevice in 2004 was a big anti-terrorist operation where they found all these young British Muslim men who were plotting to blow up the Blue Water shopping centre and nightclubs, and it was called the fertiliser bomb bomb plot trial. Chris Morris sat in on it while researching the sitcom that eventually turned into the film Four Lions. The prime defendant was a man called Omar Khayyam from nearby High Wycombe. He was 24, had been to a quite posh school and the LSE, I think. And he was the only one of the defendants who gave evidence. And he gave evidence for one day, and then he didn't give evidence the next day as expected, and none of the others did because they realised it had really backfired. And one of the things he said was, when I heard about 9/11, I was happy. Now, that was the headline everywhere, and I knew that was the top line. But he also, in that evidence, said, because he'd been to jihadi training camps in Pakistan, he said, most British Pakistanis support jihad in Kashmir, they support terrorist training camps. His family had connections to the ISI, the Pakistan Intelligence Services, and they were the ones who actually, they got him back because they didn't want him out there. But he said, when I came home, I got a hero's welcome in High Wycombe and I was garlanded with flowers. Now, no one else noticed this. And I thought, this is the first time we've had a public admission that there's an issue about the enemy within. And of course, subsequently, you had the whole Labour government developing the Preventing Violent Extremism strategy, into which they poured huge amounts of money. The new head of MI5, Jonathan Evans, gave a speech to the Society of Editors in 2007. I was there. When he talked about all this as a problem, he said 2,000 people being watched. They had a huge issue with teenagers being groomed by Islamists. There were dozens of active plots, which the MI5 say they broke over the coming years. There was a story there that actually most journalists missed completely because they were looking for a very superficial headline and they weren't looking for something more. And I could argue it might be to do with my background, it might be to do with I'd done a lot of work on anti-terrorism stories. But it was also about listening, just listening and making notes and then working out what was the most important stuff said. I was going to show you some stuff about the impact it's had, but I think I've kind of done that. So in conclusion, at its best, news writing is spare, unsensational, conveys facts. As a reporter, you might try to add details or hint at more for readers. And you can put in fun references, and this is my little fun bit to finish with, which is sometimes you get it with headline writers. And I think there was someone who was a Rainer Fassbinder film fan. Right, this was a headline in the Times. Hunted Fox finally runs out of friends. And it was just, if you're a fan of Rainer Fassbinder films, Fox and Seine Freunde is a film about a bunch of homosexuals, and one of them gets exploited. And I don't know, it's just one of these little fun things that journalists sometimes do. There's also a game called News Bingo. Do you ever play this? I don't know if you do it in papers. But, a friend gives you a word or a phrase you have to embed in your script. And I used to play this a lot, especially when I was getting close to leaving Channel 4 News. So, and I really didn't give a... so although, I said, no, I can't work, motherfucker, into Channel 4 News anyhow. But someone gave me the phrase hot tub, and I did manage to work the phrase hot tub into the news that night because we had a story about a volcano. So I talked about the hot tub of the caldera, of which I'm very proud. Quick example of a headline. I showed you the headlines at the top where, John Kerry refuses to speak French. So the key thing is sometimes you have to tell people you want them to read a story that they would choose not to read. And in the days where people are being encouraged to form their own news bulletins by aggregating their kind of favourites, it's really important to try and be able to grab people. And I do this on Twitter a lot. So my example was, I wrote a tweet about why the Mayfair Delinquency Clinic for Distressed Nymphomaniacs was a perfect start for a career in children's television. And this was about a woman who created Play School in Jackanory, who's a friend of mine, and I did an event with her at the BFI. And she actually had her first job as a secretary in this clinic, and she recalled there being distressed nymphomaniacs, and she used to read them stories. And someone said, you should work for the BBC on Listen with Mother. But I had all these guys clicked on it and went, there weren't very many nymphomaniacs in that story. But I thought the job was done. Can I squeeze in one more quick one, which is, it's just a story about missing news, and I think that's my biggest concern, is that all the omissions that we don't know about, you don't know about. When I was at Channel 4 News, the story still haunts me. I'd been on holiday in India, and I was driving back from Agra. I'd been seeing the Taj Mahal, and I was driving back to Delhi, and there were these thousands of people, and they were barefoot, and they were carrying spears. They were tribal peoples, because India has tribal peoples whose lives haven't changed for thousands of years. And they were marching on Delhi to protest over evictions, because they had no land rights, and in the developing economy, they're being thrown off their land, and they're being encouraged with the help of foreign NGOs to do something about it. So they walked to Delhi, and by the time they got there, I was back in London, I was at work, and I saw the pictures come in on the AP News Agency, and I said, let's do a piece on this, or at least a short underlay, and I wrote one. And what I really remember was there was a woman who was like a really tiny little woman, middle-aged, had never had any power, and she had some foreign aid workers with it, obviously been helping them and getting media attention, and she was saying, I thought I had no rights, but I'm so excited to be here. I feel empowered. And I know that word's become so naff in England because of girl power, but it meant something to see these people feel that they could make an impact, they were getting international attention. And what happened? Channel 4 News dropped the story, but I suspect we ran something about David Beckham's house was burgled. So, news writing can only do its job if it gets on air, and sometimes we have to battle it a bit. But overall, I love the joy of news writing.